Well, a major scare in the skies after a Southwest jet hits a bird, taking out an engine, forcing the pilot to make an emergency landing. It happened just 30 minutes after takeoff at an airport in North Carolina. Passengers say it was a very scary event.
We were about like a third of the way down on the runway, and all of a sudden I heard a boom. I saw the flashes out the window, and then people were saying, "Oh my gosh, it's on fire, it's on fire."
It was very, very scary.
Well, the plane continued taking off, headed to Chicago, ended up making a safe return back to North Carolina. None of the 124 people on board was hurt.
Well, making the case for war. Maybe. We're awaiting testimony for America from America's top diplomat and defense chiefs, pushing hard for Congress to authorize military strikes in Syria. But not everyone is on board, obviously. Many of the loudest critics, rising conservative stars like Senators Rand Paul and Mike Lee. We've all heard the reasons as to why, and here are a few of them summed up neatly for us today by Brett Stevens of the Wall Street Journal. He writes, quote, "Here's one of the reasons it's not America's war. There isn't a compelling national interest to intervene. We'd be coming in on the side of al-Qaeda. There's no end game. It would be another Iraq." Stevens goes on to argue that those arguments essentially miss the point, and the Syria debate, in his words, is exposing the isolationist worm eating its way through the GOP apple. Brett is here with us now for more on that. What do you mean by that, Brett?
Well, look, you know, the Republican Party way back in the day, in the 1930s and early 1940s, was the party that opposed any intervention in Europe, really right until we were hit at Pearl Harbor. And then under Robert Taft was opposed to our membership in NATO. I think most Americans would agree that it's a good thing we entered the war, saved Western civilization, and then defeated Soviet communism in an Atlantic alliance. But that tendency never went away, and I see some of this kind of boiling up again in the Syria debate. I think a lot of Republicans have sincere concerns, and they're genuine, about the competence of our commander-in-chief, about his willingness to do the job that needs to be done with Assad. And those are fair and sober-minded concerns. But there's a second line of thought that says the president has no right to go to war without congressional authorization, or this is a civil war in which we have no interest in who wins. And those really are kind of neo-isolationist thoughts.
So, but on that, and just, you know, for review, isolationism is a policy of non-participation, right, in foreign events. That's one of the general ways to describe it. What if that's the way that the American people truly feel now? It's not just a political platform, but it's the way that Americans themselves are feeling at this time.
Well, and in fact, I think there's a lot of opinion polling that bears that out. You know, Henry Kissinger once said that America goes between periods of overcommitment and periods of isolationism. And if you can say that the history of the last 10 years was a period of overcommitment, we're now overreacting to that with an isolationism, with the idea that somehow nothing that happens in Syria matters to us, that its use of chemical weapons doesn't matter to us, that the signal it sends the people in places like Tehran and Pyongyang shouldn't matter to us, because it does matter when the United States, when an American president says there will be consequences, and there are no consequences.
Have our actions, though, or lack thereof, Republican or Democrat or whatever, already shown evidence of an isolationist policy that's in the works, regardless of what we say about it
and
now?
I think the biggest isolationist really in the United States today is Barack Obama. When he talks about nation building at home, he creates a false dichotomy between what we do abroad and what we do at home. And that's a kind of an isolationist thought, that, for instance, that our investment in global security is somehow taking things away from us here.
Well, you hear about that all the time when it comes to money.
Right, exactly. If only we weren't spending our essentially trivial amounts of money on foreign aid, we wouldn't have a deficit. I'm sorry, folks, but the reason we have huge deficits is because we have giant, out-of-control entitlement programs that have nothing to do with military spending, much less foreign aid or military intervention.
We really should be talking about these things as completely linked. When we talk about nation building at home, we are talking about Syria and Iran and all these other things that are happening outside of our borders.
We want a world that is conducive to free trade, to American security and American values. That benefits us at home. And the idea is that somehow if we pay more attention to, say, our infrastructure, or we pay less attention to Syria, we'll pay more attention to our infrastructure. That's just a false dichotomy.
And there's plainly at this time no evidence at this moment where that's being true. We're spending a lot of time as we go into this congressional session where we're going to be talking a lot about the debt and the deficit, but now being dominated by conversations about Syria. I want to ask you briefly before we go about this issue about credibility, because our viewers are hearing a lot about it from the president, from Secretary Kerry, from the senators, that our credibility at this moment in time is completely on the line. Do you buy into that? Is it?
Well, I totally accept the critics of the president who are looking at this guy who has trashed American credibility by letting one chemical weapons red line after another be eroded.
And you say this guy being the president.
And erased. But at the end of the day, as a colleague of mine put it, paraphrasing Donald Rumsfeld, you go to war with the president you have. And we are not only interested in what happens in Syria. Republicans and conservatives should be interested in executive prerogatives, executive authority. One day we're going to have another conservative in the White House, and we're going to rue the day that Obama went to Congress to ask permission to carry out a strike like this.
So you think Republicans need to get in line?
I think that the alternative would be a disaster for the United States.
Right, great to see you. Thank you very much. Some big ideas there. John?
Well, the tyrant continues his defiance. Syrian President Assad's blunt warning for the United States as President Obama tries to sell Congress on a military strike against his regime. We'll continue to be live from the Middle East.